So good evening and welcome along to this latest Google Hangout. Just wanted to give some thoughts based on what we saw at the combine today with the running backs and the offensive line working out, and some general thoughts as well, and take some of your questions at the end, and then talk a little bit about this Jason LaCanfora article that has come out in the last few moments talking about the future of Earl Thomas and Michael Bennett. So I wanted to start with the injury news today. Three of the players that we've talked about the most, possibly over the last few weeks, have ended up injured after the first day of workouts. I'm not sure whether we're some kind of jinx with that. But Isaiah Wynn had been playing with a torn labrum during the season for Georgia, obviously had surgery after the Senior Bowl, so he's not been working out at the combine. Billy Price partially tore his pec during the bench press yesterday. You probably saw that news there. So he didn't go through any of the drills today. And now Ronald Jones II is injured. He's injured a hamstring running the 40-yard dash. And it's a shame because Price and Jones II had a real chance to have a big performance at the combine. Now Price likely won't work out at all before the draft and faces a possible surgery. He says he's not going to have the surgery, but I think maybe down the line he probably will, so that he's ready for training camp. And Jones II is going to work out at the USC Pro Day, according to his agent. So I guess on the plus side, the stock won't rise up after the combine. That could benefit the Seahawks, but it's a real disappointment that three players that we've talked about an awful lot, Billy Price, Ronald Jones II, and Isaiah Wynn, have really done nothing at the combine. So a big shame there. I did want to touch as well on some of the things that I didn't have a chance to mention in the TEF piece, which is published there, the TEF review of 2018. If you missed it, go and check out all the results today, some thoughts on the running backs that the Seahawks might be targeting as well. But wanted to give some general thoughts on the offensive line performance today. Will Hernandez had a sensational day, absolutely fantastic in the drills. The cone drills, for example, he looked smooth and a fluid runner. Looked like he'd really benefit from the weight that he's lost since the Senior Bowl. I think he's lost about 20 pounds since Mobile. So looked really good for that. Ran very well. Good 40, good 10-yard split. His kick slide was smooth and accurate. He was one of the few players in Group 1 of the offensive line who actually did the drill properly and took on the coaching and was able to follow the instructions there. Worked well in the spatial drills. He just looked really, really good today. Had an explosive workout as well, scored well in TEF. For me, he was the most impressive performer of the day and just looks like a very high draft pick, a very talented player. I don't think this is going to rise his stock up ridiculously. For example, I don't think he's suddenly going to find himself in the top 20 or the top 15 or anything like that. I think more than anything, it just cements his place as a late first or an early second round pick. And as an option for the Seahawks, I think he'd be a fine choice with their first selection. I think Isaiah Wynn is probably a better player based on what you see on the tape. But Hernandez is an option too. When you watched him on tape for UTEP, one thing is you wondered how athletic and mobile he was going to be. He's quite a straight line blocker. But then you see him in Mobile look really good on the move. You see him at the combine and again showing mobility, showing quickness, great 10-yard split. And you just think that he's going to be a really fine player at the next level. So I think that this will be a good draft to look at left guard for the Seahawks, and I think Isaiah Wynn and now Will Hernandez are two really good options there. Other players who helped their case today. I'm not talking necessarily about TEF here. This is just a general thought on how the drills went. I thought Pittsburgh's Brian O'Neill had a really solid workout, in particular during the defensive back drill where you have to sink your hips and drop backwards. He was really good, received some praise from the coaches while he was doing that drill. He ran a 4.8 240. Looks the part of a former tight end and an athlete. And I think on tape and at the Senior Bowl, you see quite a lot of issues. There are technique issues. He lunged too much at the Senior Bowl while trying to block, got beat a few times. Doesn't win with a lot of power. Not the most explosive player. But when you watch him today, there's clearly something to work with. If he can get stronger, then maybe he could be a really decent, if not a left tackle, a right tackle at the next level. Might be securely in round 2 after what we saw today. And depending on how desperate teams are for offensive tackles, he might go earlier than that. The other player I wanted to mention as well is Colton Miller, a player that a lot of people are going to be talking about today from UCLA. He's nearly 6'9". He's going to struggle with leverage as a consequence. He presents this big old target for defensive linemen to attack off the edge. Yet his 10-1 broad jump was a record for offensive linemen at the combine. Showed he had a ton of potential too. And in a league where defensive linemen are so much more explosive than offensive linemen, it won't be a shock if a team convinces itself between now and April that they've got to take a chance on Colton Miller. His upside potential is higher than Mike McGlinchey at Notre Dame, for example, who's another tall prospect at about 6'7", 6'8". And there's been a bit of talk that Colton Miller was in that first round range anyway, first or second round, that some teams really liked him, others were not quite as sure. I think his performance today pushes him closer to the first round than it does further away. So maybe solidly in round 2 and a player who could go in round 1. Who struggled today? Clearly Orlando Brown at Oklahoma had a terrible workout. The TEP numbers show that, but his general demeanor, the coaches were calling him out on a couple of occasions, didn't have a good day. Hard to see him going in the first round after today. And Jamarco Jones at Ohio State really didn't separate himself from some of the other players today. And it was a shame. So many players were unable to participate in key drills overall. Running back and offensive line, whether it was injuries, whether it's just got a medical exclusion, that they're going to just prefer to run, for example, at their pro day. There's quite a few players missing today, and hopefully that's not going to be a trend for the next 3 days as well. At running back, you'll have seen the players that we've identified as possible targets for the Seahawks. We've done this for the last couple of years with some success. It enabled us to sort of locate CJ Prosise and Chris Carson as options for the Seahawks. Well, today, the names that have kind of pinpointed here, Saquon Barkley, there's no chance they're going to draft him. He's going to be in the first 3 picks. But after that, Kerryon Johnson, great size, the kind of size that the Seahawks have looked for, 5'11", 213 pounds, an incredible 40-inch vertical, which was just 1 inch less than Saquon Barkley, a 10'6" broad, very, very explosive. That is the thing the Seahawks look for, explosive power in the running game and size. And Kerryon Johnson ticks both boxes. And I'm going to come back onto him in a moment. I'm just going to run through the names and then we'll come back to specific players. Bo Scarborough, 6'0", 228 pounds, another 40-inch vertical, a 10'9" broad, which is better than Kerryon's. Didn't have the best college tape, but certainly an explosive athlete. Nick Chubb, back to his best, 5'11", 227, 38.5-inch vertical, 10'8" broad jump. Fantastic workout for Nick Chubb. Great to see. And John Kelly at Tennessee, 5'10", 216 pounds, 35-inch vert, a 10-0 in the broad, a very tenacious player that we talked about in the last Google Hangout, and another option for the Seahawks there. So they're kind of the 5 names that I'm focusing on at the moment. Chubb, Kelly, and Johnson are the more physical, tougher backs. They can help set the tone for this team. I also think that Ronald Jones II is somebody who could do some of that. He's a smaller running back, but he does play with a physicality, very tough to bring down, and is incredibly sudden and explosive. I think he had a 36.5-inch vertical, which kind of testified some of that. And if they do sign someone like Carlos Hyde in free agency, then watch out, because Hyde and Chris Carson and Ronald Jones II could be a great group of running backs to go into the season with. But that's the great thing about this draft class, I think, is that I can talk about that as a possibility. That, yeah, maybe they draft Ronald Jones, maybe they sign Carlos Hyde, put them with Chris Carson, and you've got 3 options there. But they don't have to force the issue either with someone like Ronald Jones in the first round or with Carlos Hyde in free agency. You know, they could sign a very modest hedge in free agency. They could wait in the draft and maybe rounds 2, 3, or 4. You know, that's the great thing. There are options across the board in this draft and in the free agent market as well. So whether it's someone like Nick Chubb in round 2, whether it's Kerryon Johnson late first, second round, whether it's Bo Scarborough or John Kelly later on, there is definitely some options here for the Seahawks. To talk about the players in particular, you know, Kerryon Johnson, if we've written about him, go on Google Seahawks Draft Blog, Kerryon Johnson. If you'll find the articles, look in the archive of the blog if you want to find out a little bit about him. We've linked to the piece an awful lot. Kerryon helped Auburn get to the SEC championship. It was his running combined with Auburn's defense which got them there. And it was hard not to watch Auburn at the end of the year when they absolutely destroyed Georgia and then beat Alabama in, I think, back-to-back weeks. It was very Seahawky. It was how the Seahawks used to win, with Marshawn Lynch and a defense. And if the Seahawks want to get back to that, Kerryon Johnson did that, and they should pick a couple of those Auburn defenders as well, because that was a tenacious, physical, fast fly to the ball defense, dancing on the field in between downs, had that camaraderie, that togetherness on the field, very much like the Seahawks in 2013 and 2014. And then got this big old running back on the other side of the ball who was just the tone setter, was the guy that they leaned on. And Kerryon Johnson was a player that we identified many weeks ago during that run as someone the Seahawks could be interested in. He's hit the size marks. He's hit the explosive marks. He has got to be an option for the Seahawks. A very, very dynamic player. Similar running style to Chris Carson. Seems to fall forward like Chris Carson. Also has some of the patience of Le'Veon Bell in the backfield. So definitely a player to keep an eye on. Nick Chubb is just an all-football, Mr. Football type of player. Very serious person, willing to be physical and run at you. He's kind of that Jonathan Stewart, Frank Gore type of runner. And after he's clearly shown today that he's back to what he was in 2013. The knee injury is behind him. He's explosive. He's fast. He's physical, and Nick Chubb is back, and someone's going to get a steal. If he's in that second round range or later, some people have projected him later, then someone's going to get a steal with Nick Chubb. John Kelly could complement either of those players, or someone like Carlos Hyde, or someone like Chris Carson, or someone completely different. He's the kind of guy you want to give 10 touches a game to. Use him in the passing game. Plays with intensity, likes to pass block, good as a pass catcher on screens and all sorts. And if you do need him to run up the middle, he can do that as well. So John Kelly, maybe he's going to go in that sort of round 4 type of range. Could be a little bit of a sleeper on day 3 as someone who really helps out a team down the line. I think Tennessee's John Kelly's definitely a name to keep an eye on. What about some of the names are not mentioned there? Rashad Penny's borderline whether he fits Seattle. Ditto Royce Freeman as well. I wouldn't count either player out. They may have just tested a little bit lower down in terms of explosion than ideally you would have liked compared to some of the players they've considered in the past. They may not necessarily be Seattle's first choices, but they could still be options for the Seahawks. People are going to pair Darius Guice with Seattle a lot, so get ready for that. You're going to see him in mock drafts at number 18. You're going to see him linked to the Seahawks an awful lot, because he does have some of the aspects that the Seahawks would look for. I mean, he's very similar to Thomas Rawls in his running style. His personality is quite similar. He spent yesterday at his press conference constantly comparing himself to Marshawn Lynch. I don't think it's a particularly accurate comparison myself, but that is what he was doing. And he's tough and he runs hard, and the Seahawks like that. And if the Seahawks want a tough physical runner, they may well look at Darius Guice. But the thing is, he's a 4.49 runner, but it's not difference-making speed. He isn't particularly explosive. He had a 31.5-inch vertical, didn't do the broad jump. It would be a curious first pick for Seattle if they did take Guice, because he's not like any of the backs they've drafted before. Now, it could be a complete change of approach, and they might just think this guy's so good that we have to take him early. I'm not going to rule that out, but it would be a curious change of direction for them to make that pick with their first-round pick or after trading down, because that's not the kind of thing they've done in the past. And as I mentioned, he's very similar to Thomas Rawls. His personality and approach similar too. Not necessarily a bad thing, but maybe it's time for a more measured runner, someone who can be physical, can be violent as a runner, but someone who's also in a bit of control as well, and has got that control in the running game that Rawls maybe lacked at times. Sony Michel didn't do the broad or the vertical, which was a big disappointment, and it's hard to judge him for Seattle based on only size and a 40-yard dash. Hopefully he's going to do those tests at the Georgia Pro Day. One other quick note on the testing before I get to the questions. Really enjoyed today watching Mike Solari bossing the O-line prospects during the drills. He acted as the teacher on the field, was a good communicator by the looks of things, constantly talking to the offensive linemen, giving them guidance on the drills. Very calm individual, but seemed to be quite authoritative in the way he was talking. It was really pleasing to see. I don't really know much about Mike Solari other than sort of stuff I studied when he was with the Seahawks in the past. But it certainly did feel like the Seahawks have got a good one here with this coach and the way that he was handling those drills. And like I say, was kind of the boss on the field during the O-line drills, much more so than in any of the other coaches. So that was a good thing. A couple of other quick points. Very excited about the linebacker class and the way that they measured today. A lot of long, big, tall prospects there who imagine are going to test well. I think the linebacker class, along with the O-line, interior O-line class, and the running back class, is the standout positions in this draft. Really looking forward to seeing the linebackers on Sunday and getting to see how they work out. And tomorrow it's going to be the tight ends and the receivers that are going to be the main points of focus for us on the blog. So we'll be doing the live blog again tomorrow. So tune us for that, and we'll have some thoughts immediately afterwards too. I am actually going to be covering a boxing event for the BBC during the evening here in the UK. So that review piece might be a little bit later than it was today, but stay tuned, it'll be there eventually. Right, on to the questions. So the first is from Nick, who sent me these questions on Twitter. He sent me 5 questions. So I'm going to try and get through these as quickly as possible. The first one, given that we might change our O-line specs this year, do you think that extends to running backs too? It's certainly possible, Nick, and this is one thing I'm going to touch on a little bit later. Just because there's been certain trends in the past doesn't mean they're going to continue forever and ever and ever. And while the Seahawks were winning games and being competitive, there was no real reason to change their mentality. Now that they've had a 9-7 season, they've changed the coaching staff, they may well change that approach as well. So anything that we're writing or saying here comes with an asterisk. It doesn't mean that this is definitely going to happen. It doesn't mean that I think it's definitely going to happen. It just means that this is what they've done in the past, and we're trying to glean that information to try and help us provide the best draft coverage this year and sort of focus on players that might be of most interest to the Seahawks, because that's more fun than just sort of trying to cover everybody and talk about everybody. There's just not enough time in the day to do that. So yes, there is a chance that the specs will change the running backs. As I mentioned, maybe they will draft Darius Guice. Maybe they will draft a Rashard Penny or somebody like that. It's a little bit different than the backs they've drafted in the past. Second question from Nick. What might we target in exchange for Mike Bennett? Well, I'm thinking if you can get anything for Mike Bennett, given his age and his contract situation, I think that will be a plus. I've seen suggestions that the Seahawks might ask for a bit too much if they want to trade him and that maybe he'll end up getting released instead. But I think if you could, I love Mike Bennett as a player. I've really enjoyed watching him as the Seahawks, but if they're going to move on, I think they'll struggle to get much more than, for example, a 6th or a 7th round pick. Nick's third question. If I remember correctly, on a Hangout or podcast, you recently mentioned we might add a mid-round linebacker. Is this due to cost, or could we chase a veteran like Derek Johnson? I just think they just need some youth and some speed and some depth at the position there, Nick. I don't think it's a case of they need to go out and get a big-name veteran. They don't want to. I would imagine Derek Johnson might want an opportunity to start, and that's not going to be the case with Bobby Wagner on the team. So I think what they need is someone who can either be a Sam Leo or someone who can provide some quality young depth to KJ Wright and Bobby Wagner, because we saw what happened when those two guys were not 100%. KJ Wright didn't play against the Rams. Bobby Wagner did, and really struggled against the Rams in that 42-7 defeat. Some young talent on linebacker would certainly be a big plus for the Seahawks. Nick's fourth question. Are you going to start breaking down 10-yard splits for running backs once they start getting reported? I'm not, Nick, because I think the thing with the Seahawks is they focus more on explosive testing rather than speed. So we've got the broad jump, we've got the vertical times and not times, numbers, and we're going to focus on that for the running backs for now. And the fifth part of the question, you brought up the idea of mimicking New Orleans' Ingram and Kamara a duo a couple of times. Is this something that Pete Carroll and John Schneider have mentioned they'd like to do? They haven't mentioned that. It's just sort of me looking at a team that have run the ball better than anybody else last year and thinking that is something that maybe the Seahawks could copy and have some success with. And there just so happens to be a player in Ronald Jones II, who I think is quite a lot like Kamara. And there happens to be a player in free agency, Carlos Hyde, who I think is quite a lot like Ingram. So that's kind of why I would piece that together. But certainly it's not something that anything that Pete or John have said. C-Mode says, how do you not overreact as a fan to the combine performances? I mean, they televise it now for a reason. The fans love seeing awesome athletes test. But if we are trying to evaluate players more like Seattle scouts than Seattle fans, how can we get the balance right with what we see on tape? Well, the thing is, Simo, there's always a battle to not overreact to the combine, but that's why I've tried to identify and focus the specifics that we need to look at. You'll notice the way the media overreacts to certain drills. For example, it's the 40-yard dash for running backs and a lot of other positions, or it's the bench press for the offensive lineman. And it's a pretty basic thing to just look at the more interesting tests and the most interesting numbers and overanalyze those. I think by researching trends, which is what we've done over the years on this blog, and looking for clues, we're able to pinpoint to some extent what we need to look at, both as fans of the Seahawks and as people who enjoy trying to work out the puzzle of what is a Seahawks draft class. And while we certainly don't get everything right, Malik McDowell's a good example of that, we'll constantly learn new information or be forced to learn from mistakes. We can still zone in on specific tests for specific positions and glean some valuable information. I know that we certainly have made mistakes in the past. The 2012 draft was a good example of that. And, I personally learned a lot from that. As someone who started the year talking about Bruce Irvin was the first player that I talked about, the first person I wrote about after the 2011 draft, saying this could be a guy the Seahawks look for. He could be the ideal Leo, and never really went back to that at any point during the year because he was being talked around about as a third-round pick and stuff like that. And we were focusing on quarterbacks an awful lot at the time. And you do learn lessons, and we know a lot more about the Seahawks now. This regime has been in charge since 2010. So I think using that information to try and project is a good thing, and that's what helps us not to overreact too much to the combine and focus on the things we need to focus on. C-Mode has got another question as well. We've talked a lot about Wynn, Price, Hernandez, but if the Hawks want to go another direction, like running back early, who are some of the quality interior offensive linemen that could get pushed down to the round 4 or round 5 range due to a deep class? Well, Wyatt Teller is a player that I keep calling him Teller Wyatt. I don't know, because it's quite clear that his first name's Wyatt. Wyatt Teller is a name to monitor. He had a very explosive workout, decent size, had a fair performance at the Senior Bowl. I have to say, though, that I thought the lesser-known offensive linemen were generally quite poor at the combine and didn't really stand out at the Senior Bowl. If they want to find a guy they like with the right kind of attitude that they just discover in meetings is the kind of person they want in the room, then that's fine. But for me, I think interior offensive line is a position you go after early and then you leave alone. And I'm not too sure whether there are players that are going to drop too much. Braden Smith gets projected in round 3 or 4. I don't think he's going to last there. So I'm not really convinced that there's going to be too many options there. And a final point from C-Mode. On that same note, if they instead wanted to slide a Fetty back inside to guard, is there anybody who has caught your eye as a possible right tackle candidate? Maybe they want Fant or even Posits to compete there. There isn't really anybody that stands out. I mean, if Colton Miller falls, then maybe, or if Connor Williams from Texas fell, then possibly another option. But this isn't a particularly fun-looking tackle class, and one that I would particularly want the Seahawks to attack as well. Nick says, right now it seems like everyone has given up on 2018 as a potential Super Bowl year and thinking of it as a launching point for 2019. These viewpoints are from the Twitter crowd, full disclosure, so it's not exactly rational, but do you hold this view too? I can't help but feel it is a little dramatic. Well, my opinion, Nick, is I don't think they will or should give up, but I do think some change is required, and it remains to be seen how that will impact the chances in 2018. It could have a horrible impact and means that they're not able to contend in the way they have in previous years, or they might be even better. I mean, that's the great thing we're going to see over free agency and in the draft and the changes they're going to make, how set up this Seahawks team is for 2018. And I think it's completely undetermined in a way it hasn't been for a few years. In previous years, we've just assumed they're going to contend. They might contend in 2018, or they might not, but we're going to find out over the next few weeks. I do think the Seahawks need to get younger and cheaper on defense. They might need new, younger players to max out the qualities of Pete Carroll's style of coaching. Maybe some of the older veterans are starting to tune out to the message. If they do make changes now, they might be well placed to be a key contender again in 2019 and beyond, even if they're not a big contender in 2018. But if they do a great job this year, that could include 2018 as well. I mean, look at the way that the Eagles turned their situation around pretty quickly. It took them, they drafted Carson Wentz, made a lot of changes last year, and this year they won the Super Bowl with Nick Foles guiding them there in the playoffs. So things can change pretty quickly, so I wouldn't rule anything out for 2018. I just think some change is going to happen. Jason says, what are your top 2 or 3 takeaways from Snyder today? 2 very quick points here. I think the takeaways I would have were major changes on the table, and practically anything could happen in this offseason. Neither Carroll or Schneider gave much away, but I think certainly they left the door open. There's no denying anything. There was no, we're not trading Richard Sherman, we're not trading Earl Thomas, we're not trading Michael Bennett. They kept everything on the table. Peter says, in your opinion, how much does a good, great combine propel a player upwards? With that in mind, does Braden Smith get into the second round with that kind of performance today? Well, a great combine can certainly help, especially for offensive linemen. I think key examples of Trent Williams in 2010 was seen as maybe a mid-first round pick or a late first-round pick and ended up going, I think, 4th overall to Washington. Eric Fisher in 2013, another player who was gradually building, had a good senior bowl, was seen as a first-round pick in general, but that ended up being the number 1 overall pick that year. So certainly you can get you can really rise up the board with a great combine. It's not the be-all and end-all, though, and on the defensive side of the ball, there are so many really good athletic defensive line testers these days that many quality performers at the combine don't get much of a bump. They kind of just retain their grades because everybody on the defensive line is kind of athletic now. So it works in different ways for different positions. Personally, I always saw Braden Smith as a top 50 type anyway. I've listed him in my top 50 prospects for quite some time, so I'm not going to suggest that he's making a big rise because of this. I think it will just kind of cement his placing. I think he's going to be a late second round pick or an early third round pick. Trevor says, is there a first round offensive tackle prospect in this draft class? My personal opinion is probably not, but I still think 2 or 3 at least are going to go in round 1. And Trevor then goes on to say, did any running back really impress you as a day 3 prospect that we have not previously discussed on the blog? Not that we haven't already discussed, Trevor, to be honest. There was nobody that really stood out today that I haven't really discussed in the past. John Kelly at Tennessee, as I mentioned earlier, is probably the most intriguing one who could still be there on day 3. I still think that Bo Scarborough is going to last to about round 4, so he's going to be another day 3 type as well, I think. Dale says, do you expect Isaiah Wynn to do the combine events on his pro day? And where do you think his TEF score might land? I'm not sure if he'll have recovered to work out at the Georgia Pro Day, Dale. I would doubt it, though. I don't think he's going to work out before the draft. It's a torn labrum surgery, so I'm not sure what he's going to do there. Not sure he'd be a great TEF tester either. He didn't have a particularly good spark combine when he worked out there, so wouldn't expect a great explosive test, but Zach Martin didn't have a particularly explosive test either, and he's the player that I would compare Isaiah Wynn the closest to Zach Martin at Dallas. So not a big concern for me. I think his tape is fantastic. Dale goes on to say it's draft day and you're secretly wishing for which player not named Barkley or Quentin Nelson to be the Hawks' first pick. Well, if I only get to discount those two names, then it'd probably be someone like Tremaine Edmonds of Virginia Tech, the linebacker. But more realistically, I'd be looking at Wynn, I'd be looking at Price, I'd be looking at Jones II, I'd be looking at Hernandez, people like Kerryon Johnson. All of those players after trading down. There are others I think would be a really good fit for the Seahawks, but they're just some of the names I think if you can trade down, get some extra picks in rounds 2 and 3, still get one of those guys, then it's a real win. And Dale also says, would you rather have the 18th pick or a high second and a high third round pick? I think I'd take the high second and third. I think the value is going to be better there in this draft. I certainly don't think, I've said it before, it's probably about 10 to 15 legit first round prospects. The Seahawks picking at 18. And then there's going to be a really deep second and third round. So I think trading down this year, it's not all a lot of fans are going to want. They're going to want them to take a pick early this year. But I do think that the value is probably better in that second and third round range. So I mentioned we were going to finish by talking about this article that has come out from Jason LaCanfora. It's titled Seahawks Likely to Part Ways with Key Defenders, plus more insider notes from the NFL Combine. If you go on to Jason LaCanfora's Twitter feed, then you can see this report. And this is what it basically says. When John Schneider says we're open to listening to anything, you should take him at his word. And trust me, other NFL teams are doing just that. The Seattle Seahawks came into this combine as one of the most intriguing teams of the 2018 offseason. Hampered by some injuries and cap issues, but the willingness and wherewithal to get creative in addressing their needs. And as the weekend begins in Indianapolis and the chatter intensifies, they've done nothing to sway that perception. Schneider, the team's shrewd and fairly fearless general manager, is very much open for business and eager to transition his roster. And that will manifest itself with several trades. He and Pete Carroll have never shied away from blockbuster swaps before, and I expect they move at least 2 of their trio of aging stars, Earl Thomas, Michael Bennett, and Richard Sherman. So there you go. Jason LaCanfora is projecting basically that he thinks at least 2 of those guys are going to go. Thomas, Bennett, and Sherman, that 2 will move on. In the past, Jason LaCanfora has broken some Seahawks stories. So when he speaks, generally it's worth listening to him. I'm not going to say that he's definitely 100% going to be right here because who can guarantee that? But he has some chops covering the Seahawks before. He goes on to say it remains to be seen what Schneider can obtain for some of what compromised the core of his Super Bowl teams, but the will is there. They won't get much for Bennett, but I get the strong sense they'll take a draft pick and then look to bolster the defensive line with a free agent. Muhammad Wilkerson, for starters, would make a lot of sense, says Jason LaCanfora. Maybe that's something that you want to discuss in the comments section on the blog. Is Muhammad Wilkerson the kind of player that you would want to bring to Seattle in place of Michael Bennett? What do you think about that? LaCanfora goes on to say, they won't give away Earl Thomas, however. They'll demand some value there with only 1 year left on the perennial Pro Bowlers deal at a manageable $8.5 million. And in the end, I suspect they can land a few day 2 picks to get something done. At this point, I'd be quite surprised if Thomas was not moved. So LaCanfora there predicting that Earl Thomas will be traded essentially, but not saying they'll get a first round pick. He's saying a few day 2 picks. So a few, that's, generally a few means more than 2. So he would have said a couple of picks. So if you can get 3 picks in rounds 2 and 3s, that's something that you would consider. Maybe that'd be a pretty good deal. We've talked about the depth there in day 2 and 3, and that could help them rebuild the roster. So is that something else that the Seahawks are going to consider there? To finish off this point, LaCanfora just goes on to say, the Seahawks have reached a phase where they have to determine who is worthy of another top-dollar contract with enough upside to merit it, and they have to reshuffle their resources. For example, they can't have this much money and cap space tied up in the secondary. And make no mistake, that process is underway. Cutting Jeremy Lane and potentially trading Thomas and Bennett for picks creates roughly $20 million in cap space to use in younger free agents, including potentially 2 of their own, Paul Richardson and Sheldon Richardson. Getting anything at all for Sherman, given his recent injuries, may prove impossible, and he could be an asset in teaching this system and techniques to some of the younger defensive backs the team will invariably bring in. Bottom line is, Schneider wants to be flexible with his roster, and that starts with an initial purge of players for picks, or for young players still on their rookie contracts. He is one of the NFL's ultimate deal makers, and a guy other teams enjoy negotiating with because of his upfront and frank style. So there you go. So, we've been talking about this for an awful long time, that change seems to be inevitable, that some of the names discussed there, Bennett, Sherman, Thomas, maybe on the way out, Cam Chancellor and Cliff Averill seem to be heading that way as well. It's going to be a fascinating few weeks. We've seen deals done already. Robert Quinn today being traded from LA to Miami. We've seen Marcus Peters go from Kansas City to LA. We've seen Alex Smith go from KC to Washington. It's a little bit surprising almost that the Seahawks haven't done a deal just yet, but it does seem like things are going to happen eventually, and that maybe there's going to be some major change, and it'd be upsetting in a way as well, because Earl Thomas and Richard Sherman and Michael Bennett, the kind of players you expected would retire as Seahawks, but you also expected they were going to win 2 or 3 championships and then retire as Seahawks, and it's maybe getting to the point now where they do have to get younger, they do have to get cheaper. They do need players who are going to maybe respond to Pete Carroll's message rather than players that have heard it for 6, 7, 8 years. And that's maybe why this change is going to happen now. And it'll make the draft a little bit more interesting if they get more picks. But it will be sad to see the likes of Earl Thomas move on, especially given everything, how fun those players have been to watch over the years, and how badly we all wanted to see them win another title to make up for what happened in 2014. But maybe it's not going to be, and maybe some change is on the way. Going to wrap up the hangout for now. If you like these videos and you want me to keep doing them, then just let me know. If you are watching on YouTube and you want to give this video a like, then please do, or subscribe to this channel, because I'll be doing a few more of these as the draft process goes on. Try and do some podcasts as well and get some interesting guests on for you before the April draft. And stay tuned to Seahawks Draft Blog. We're going to have a live blog every day during the combine. We're going to have a reaction piece immediately after that's finished, just reflecting on everything we've learned. We're going to have mock drafts next week. I'm going to have podcast appearances, I think, on Sunday and on Monday as well. So stay tuned for all that. Head over to SeahawksDraftBlog.com and enjoy the coverage of the draft in 2018.